Okay.
And we are live on the Gamification Revolution. Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. And today's guest is Mr. Brian Burke, who's coming to us live from so far our most exotic location, Andorra. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Gabe. How you doing?
Awesome. Thanks for being with us. And as some of you may know, some of you may not, Brian and I are both Canadian. Neither of us are in Canada. I'm in beautiful, cold, and sunny Boston, and you guys are all over the world. And thank you so much for being with us as you are every week. I want to remind you that you can participate, and you should participate if you can, with us today on the Gamification Revolution. Welcome to all the regulars. You can do so by logging in, choose one of your social media accounts, log into Spreecast, and you'll be able to chat with all the awesome people on the side. Hello, Juan Carlos. Hello, Dutch. Hello, Beth. Hello, Daryl. Hello, everyone who's with us all the time. And then once you're chatting, you can ask us questions. And if you actually have a camera, I can even invite you on, or Ivan, our producer, can invite you on screen to ask questions of Brian and I. This 30 minutes is for you and for me and for us, so feel free to join in and ask all those questions. Okay, so Brian, um, you were pretty much, you're an analyst at Gartner Group. I'm sure many of the folks listening know who you are, and we'll get your some contact information up for you. You were really one of the first analysts, if not the first analyst, to actually kind of call out gamification, start following it, and putting some emphasis on it, and thinking about it, and writing about it, and analyzing it. What attracted you to the subject in the first place?
Well, actually, I really kind of stumbled onto gamification. My coverage area for now the last 15 years has been enterprise architecture. And in the course of my research around enterprise architecture, one of the things that enterprise architects do is a lot of innovation management, specifically usually technology-based innovation management. And I came across a number of companies who were working in this and applying game-like constructs to innovation management. And one of the things that I had been researching was emergent systems, which also have game-like constructs, and how emergent systems are applied to innovation management. And then I came across a few companies that were doing this, and then I discovered how gamification was being used to change behaviors and develop skills. And so I really, I kind of stumbled across it, but it was lateral to my research, and I really just picked it up.
Why do you think it's important for enterprise architects and for people who deal in innovation? Why do you think it's so important for them to understand gamification? What's at the heart of the connection between those two things?
Okay, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, part of an enterprise architect's core role is to understand emerging technologies and to determine when those technologies are appropriate for deployment in the organization. One of the things that we've seen organizations focusing on is how to really engage the crowd in the development of innovation. And part of that engagement strategy is using gamification. So that, the application of gamification to innovation is part of the core role of enterprise architects. But also, enterprise architects, as gamification is coming into organizations, it's coming into the HR organization, in recruiting and training, and it's coming into other areas of the organization in employee performance management and change management and other areas as well. Enterprise architects are also responsible for the introduction of new technologies in the organization. And so for that reason, they either look at it and need it as part of their sort of toolkit, or they need to be aware of it as it's coming into the organization or as they are bringing it into the organization, and understand how to leverage it in those ways as well, both on the business side, so how gamification can be used by the business, as well as internal to the IT organization. So, gamification, because there's so many different applications, it impacts a lot of different areas of the business. And so enterprise architects really need to be aware of this trend.
So this is an interesting question, though, right? Which is the way that you make it sounds like it starts off as a tactical thing. So the enterprise architect is looking for gamification, for example, to spur crowdsourcing or to spur innovation. how does it go from being a tactic to being a strategy, which I think is something that many people in the industry will expect to see or have expected to see even beforehand? How do you see that transition? Have you observed that in your research?
Okay. In terms of gamification becoming, more of a strategy, what we're seeing is that as organizations deploy multiple gamified solutions, they come across the need to be able to integrate those solutions. So you've got, the same target audience, the same players that are using, and yet those are not integrated. And that becomes an integration challenge. It becomes really a challenge for organizations who are trying to track the interactions with their target audience across multiple platforms. And so that's really the point where it shifts away from being a tactical initiative and becomes more of a strategic initiative, is how do we start to integrate across multiple platforms. For some organizations, it starts as a strategic initiative. If you look at Vail Resorts, for example, and Epic Mix, which is a great example of using gamification to really add to the value proposition in their offer. It really started as a strategic initiative. So depending on what we see in a lot of organizations is they're applying caution. They're starting with some small things, and then when they've got multiple small things going on, they say, well, we really need to look at this as a strategy. In other organizations, particularly organizations that are going with customer-focused applications, it starts right from being a strategy that the organization is pursuing.
So that's very interesting, right? It can come from either path. And certainly, even in my context, I see a lot of companies kind of doing it one way or the other. And in fact, yesterday I was on the phone with a very, very well-known large financial institution where this sort of classic scenario had happened. Now I'll ask this question, and then we'll get to Maria's question. So they're doing some training and development, and the senior management said to this person who's responsible for training, gamification is really, really cool. It's awesome. We need to gamify training, so go do this. And you've got 3 months, go do it because gamification matters. And the person came to me and said, I'm not sure why it matters. What do you have to say? What do you think about organizations that act that way? What's your sense of how organizations can transcend that jumping on the buzzword instead of something more substantive or meaningful?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, gamification is the latest shiny object that people are jumping onto. And, I think that initially in the first sort of couple of years or the early years as gamification was evolving, there was a lot of people who saw this as a shiny object and they went ahead without, necessarily having a good understanding of what their business objectives were with gamification. So it was just, I want to do some gamification. Gamification is cool. Give me some gamification. And that, that's clearly not the way that we'd like to see organizations jump into this. We'd like to see organizations, define what their business objectives are, what the player objectives are, understand what they're trying to achieve. And so, my advice to people who come at this in terms of, and certainly I have these conversations as well, when I'm talking to clients and they say, we want to do some gamification. We don't know if we should start with training or we should start with this or we should start with that. And I said, my answer is you need to start with what your business objectives are. What are you actually trying to achieve with gamification? Gamification is an engagement strategy to motivate people. So, what target audience do you want to motivate? How do you want to motivate them? What actions do you want them to take? What's the business outcome that you're trying to achieve? And if you start thinking through that problem, as opposed, and then is gamification the right tool? Perhaps it is. But you need to think of it from the business perspective to say, really what problem are we trying to solve or what opportunity are we trying to take advantage of? It's not, let's have some gamification because it's cool.
I think it's so interesting that you say that because one of the things I was really surprised about in my work doing consulting and design work is how much of a therapist I have to be often to my clients. They have some deep-seated issue and they're coming to us ostensibly for gamification, but really it's to try to solve some underlying business problem around engagement or this sort of sliding kind of issue around engagement that they need to solve. And they're often sort of surprised at how we push back and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe gamification is not the answer. Maybe there's a business problem underneath it. Do you think this sets us up as an industry to be more substantive and to have more like lasting effect? Or do you think that that speaks to kind of how gamification will just be another tool in the toolbox?
I think both. I think that gamification will have a lasting effect. There are undeniable successes over the long term. If you look at Nike Plus, sort of a classic example of gamification success, undeniable success over the long term, 18 million users. So gamification is not going away. But gamification too will become a tool in the toolbox for engagement. And it really, it's not a magic elixir. It has there's opportunities and limitations in what you can do with gamification. And I think that that's what we're starting to see now are what are not only the opportunities, but what are the limitations. And I think that people are beginning to come around to understand that gamification is not just simply slapping some points and badges on things and magic's going to happen. It needs to be the appropriate problem. We need to identify who the target audience is, and we, most importantly, need to motivate players to achieve their goals as opposed to achieving the organizational goals. And that often sounds sort of counterintuitive, but oftentimes player goals and organizational goals are aligned. And what is most often successful is where those player goals and organizational goals are aligned, and a gamified solution is positioned to enable the players to be successful in achieving their goals.
I think, and that's actually a really good segue to Maria's question. Thanks for this question, Maria, which we have underneath. So let me just kind of paraphrase this. So when you looked at organizations, and we're going to talk about some of your work, some of your research and your writing, so when we look at gamification applied in the enterprise, how do we use it in a way that's both consistent with the experience that users are having? So this is one kind of common thing, like, if we throw the 3D virtual world and the princess and the dragon into the enterprise, all of a sudden, we're playing, adventure games when we need to be doing accounts payable processing, right? And on the other side, how do we avoid that? How do we prevent it from being boring or simplistic if we're just like throwing some points or badges or something into accounts payable backend? What have you learned about the ways that organizations that are successful kind of balance these two ideas?
Well, excuse me. It's a point. A lot of people, when they hear the term gamification, they think that they kind of jump on the idea that it's about making something look like a video game. And actually, gamification and video games and reward programs are very different things. They're pushing very different buttons. And we need to have clarity about what buttons we want to push. So video games, they have only one purpose. They are engaging people in an entertainment proposition. So the only thing they're trying to do is entertain you. Rewards programs, which are often confused with gamification as well, they are, they're going to compensate you. So if you take some action that the organization wants, they will compensate you with some kind of, most often, tangible reward. So games are pushing the fun button. Reward programs are pushing the compensation button, and gamification is pushing the motivation button. Having these, three things, conflating these three things is part of the problem with gamification that I see right now, because they all share some characteristics, points, badges, leaderboards, and all quests, and all of that kind of stuff. They get confused, but the differences are more important than the similarities between gamification, rewards programs, and video games. And so we want to avoid confusing those three. You can't take something that is inherently boring and make it fun by turning it into a video game. Making it look like a video game doesn't necessarily make something fun. There are some successes, and clearly there's serious games that span those two. But I think that it's important to understand what the primary motivation is. And if what we're trying to do is motivate people to achieve their goals, then we don't need story lines and animations and avatars and all of that kind of stuff. If you look at Nike Plus, there's none of that. You look at a lot of successful gamification applications, that doesn't exist. And so understanding and being able to distinguish between those things and leveraging the right game mechanics to engage the audience, I think is really, really important, and being able to make that distinction is really important.
Isn't that hard? I mean, I think that's one of the challenges is that distinction is actually really hard often to explain to executives, right? I think part of the challenge is like, you have this loop where games are really big and people love games, and so you got executives going, games, let's game things, let's turn things into games, and then it's like, oh, well, actually we have to kind of crab walk back from that, and it's kind of like games, but not really. We're talking about something different. A lot is made of, the issue of like, the other way around, trying to convince executives to adopt gamification because of resistance to games. But there's also the other side of this, which is executives who are very pro games having a misconception of what it is that we need to do. Do you have a sense of, if you had to take the pulse of your corporate clients, because I know you interact with lots of big organizations and that you provide a lot of counsel in that area, where are we now if we're taking the temperature in the US? Are we 10% of the way in? Are we 50% of the way in? You've made some big, bold predictions in the past. Where are we now in terms of gamification adoption?
I think that there is still a lot of organizations that misunderstand what gamification is, but that is getting better. I see more and more of my client interactions. People start with a reasonably good definition for what gamification is, and so there's a lot less confusion than there used to be, but it still exists. To distinguish in distinguishing video games and reward programs from gamification, as well as a lot of confusion exists that around just simply what gamification is about. I had a client call not too long ago from a technology service provider, and they had a request from one of their clients to customize their software, incorporate game elements. And so the conversation started like this, where the client said to me, we've got a request from one of our clients to integrate game mechanics into our product. And he says, literally, what they're looking for is some points, badges, and leaderboards. Technically, it doesn't look too complicated. So, we think we should just go ahead with it. And you get into this whole discussion around, yes, technically, this is very simple stuff. For any decent software development organization, slapping onto points, badges, and leaderboards and things like that is not tremendously complicated. But what gamification really is designing an experience for the players, and that is an entirely different thing. And so, being able to engage and motivate people to achieve a specific result, take them through this journey, design that experience, is where people are still struggling. And I think that we're getting better. I have more conversations with clients who understand this more clearly, but we do have a long way to go. We've got a ways to go yet. And I think that, some of the things that we're seeing around gamification, where we're seeing more people from, digital engagement organizations and communications organizations and behavioral scientists and those kinds of folks that are getting involved. I think that that's all positive because, often in organizations that gamification either started in the marketing department, maybe went to the IT department, and IT people, they don't know how to design a player experience. They don't do that. They develop software that's built to be efficient. And what gamification is not built to be efficient, it's built to be engaging. So we still have a ways to go. But I see certainly positive signs in terms of my conversations, in terms of the solutions I'm seeing deployed today. I think that we're starting to turn the corner where people are starting to understand really what is the power and limitations of gamification.
Well, I think that's great news. And, for those of you who don't know, Brian will be one of the featured speakers at Gamification Summit, which is coming June 10th through the 13th to San Francisco. If you've never been before, you guys, it's super, super fun. Brian's got a lot to say about it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that too. You can actually come with a special discount code as a viewer of Gamification Revolution. It's GamRev. The site is gsummit.com. Check out all the speakers. It's going to be super awesome. And I know that, Brian, along with everyone else, will be sharing lots of their different experiences, both on the enterprise side and also on the customer loyalty side. I know that, Brian, one of the things that you have to do as an analyst is make some predictions. And you've got to talk both about the potential future growth and the potential future risks for everyone. And of course, I'm sure your big corporate clients and you work with some of the biggest companies in the world. They really want to understand, how does this fit into the ecosystem of important ideas, things they need to watch, things they need to know about. So one of the things that you said that probably has ignited the greatest amount of controversy in this community is this idea that 80% of gamification projects will fail. Now, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I know that everybody wants to hear what you have to say about it. I always thought that this was actually a pretty good stat relative to most corporate IT implementations, which generally don't do that well. What is that 80% stat about, and what are the lessons that people who do gamification for a living, especially those who are in big enterprises, need to take away from your conclusion?
Okay, well, let me give you a bit of a history of that stat, because I know there's been a lot of sort of speculation, confusion about where that came from. First of all, I made that prediction. It was published in November of 2012. So it's been out there for a while. This is not something I predicted for 2014 in the last month or something. It's been out there for a while. And in my conversations up until that point, I was having these conversations where I'd be talking to clients, and I'd be talking to either had just implemented a gamified solution, or they were looking to tune a gamified solution. And for organizations that I'm talking to that have already implemented a solution, I inevitably ask, what are the business outcomes that you anticipated, and what are the business outcomes that you've achieved? And I would get a lot of hesitation. I'd get, we're working on this, we need to tune it a little bit more, or we launched in summer and it was a bad time and we haven't got there. And I started to question that, if people were, certainly I did get some organizations that were telling me that, yes, they'd achieved these specific business results, and that was good news. But I was getting a lot of organizations that, as we talked about earlier, they kind of jumped on the gamification bandwagon, didn't think about the objectives that they were really trying to achieve, and either not measuring or not recognizing those successes. So that led me to do a little bit of research around. I looked at basically all of the published gamification stories that I could come across. That if organizations had measurable business success, that they would talk about that. And what I found out was that about 90% of organizations were talking about what they were doing, not what they do. So I said, okay. So even though I would expect that people would talk about their positive business results, a lot of people are not talking about the positive business results. They're talking about what they were doing and not so much what they were achieving. And so I started to say, well, I think a lot of people are probably not, in fact, achieving the business results that they anticipate at this point in time. And we see, of course, at that time, there was a lot of confusion about what gamification was, and a lot of activity to slapping points and badges on things. And so that's what the background that led to that prediction was, a lot of conversations, some analysis of the market in terms of what people were reporting when they were talking about their gamified solutions. And then finally, there's, as you say, Gabe, a long history of high failure rates in all IT projects. So if you talk to business managers about what are the percentage of IT projects that actually achieve the business outcomes that they intend to, there's been lots of different surveys on this. Gartner's done some as well. But the range will usually be between about 50 to 70% failure rate, failure to meet business objectives. And so it's actually not that big of a jump to go to 80% for gamification, which is new technology, a new trend that people don't understand, and specifically talk about failure to achieve business objectives. You get a very different picture when you talk to people on project teams about project failure, because they will say the project succeeded, and we all know how that works in IT. You go through and you've been on a project, spent a couple of months, worked very hard. it got deployed, we have a party, we say it's good, and we go home. You know, it's a success, and we go home.
Right.
But if you talk to business managers, you get a very different story about what the outcomes of IT projects are in terms of meeting the business objectives.
So here's the question, right? Which is, I think Dan sort of saying this in the chat and Beth echoing it. You know, if you were measuring the wrong things, if the business model isn't correctly aligned, of course, these projects won't work. What advice would you give, Brian, based on kind of your research? What's your takeaway from that? What advice would you give people who are doing gamification in the enterprise in order to be in the 20% that succeed or grow that 20%? What do they need to do?
Yeah, the very, very first thing is to understand what are the business outcomes that you are trying to achieve. That puts some boundaries around what you're going to do, and you know, helps you to avoid just creating some kind of gamified solution for the sake of creating it because it's cool. The other thing that's really key, important, is understanding the target audience and the players. What are their motivations? How do their motivations align with the organization's motivations? And if you can line those two things up, so if you can say, well, you know, these are the organization's goals and these are the player goals, you're already halfway there. You've got some overlap between those two, and then it's a process of understanding, you know, what are the specific actions that we want people to take, and how are we going to encourage them to take those actions so that they will achieve their goals. So if you think of gamification, first of all, from having absolute clarity around what are the business objectives that you're trying to achieve, which bounds your problem, and then having clarity around the player objectives, player goals, and then going through that experience design process, I think that organizations have a good chance of being successful in gamification solutions. But that was the last two words of that prediction, that they would fail to meet business objectives primarily due to design issues. And those are all design issues.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I know that you've talked a lot about, you talk a lot about this, and obviously lots of this has come up, and many folks probably don't know that you've written this new book, which is coming out in April, called Gamify, and how gamification helps motivate people to do extraordinary things. So as you're, you know, this tremendous wealth of knowledge as you're going through and kind of doing all this research for Gamify, and we put the link to the book there for Amazon.com, and you can pre-order it. It's there in the discussion. So what were your kind of like biggest takeaways? What were the biggest things that surprised you in doing this research and working with all these people and putting together Gamify? What was it that really kind of caught you by surprise? You know, you're clearly, anybody who knows you, Brian, knows that you are, you know, incredibly intelligent and very analytical. Where were the moments where Brian Burke was like, wow, this is amazing? What really got you excited in this process?
Well, first of all, what really got me excited was, you know, the prospect of writing a book, which would put together a lot of pieces that I touched through my research, but enabled me to bring that together. And you know, I guess the challenge, of course, was to string together and fill in the gaps and turn that into a story about you know, how gamification is successful. I think that a couple of things that are unique were kind of a discovery for me throughout writing the book, was this constant questioning myself around what makes gamification different. And you know, I went through a lot of the different models that are similar to gamification, and we talked a little bit about video games and reward programs, and we separated those out, and I separate them out in the book with a lot more explanation on why that works, and you know, how you follow the money to identify one from another, and so on. But I think one of the real key points in the book was where I came to the realization of how gamification is actually different from anything else. And really what it is that it comes down to digital engagement. And digital engagement means that we take these paradigms that have been around for a long time, some of them like, you know, Boy Scouts, military handing out badges and things like that. Actually, and those are very close sort of metaphors for gamification. And what is the limitations of that? Well, the limitations of that is that it uses a face-to-face model, it uses a physical motivation model. And what gamification does is it takes that, those same levers of and uses a digital engagement model to be able to leverage that in terms of growing the size of the audience, spanning distance, time, all of those kinds of things. So one of the things that I think is key about gamification is really understanding all of these, methods and approaches to motivation. None of this is new. People are not. We didn't, magically wake up being different in 2007. All of these things have been done before. The real power of gamification is that digital engagement model that is new, that allows you to take these motivation and engagement techniques and really, push it out to a large number of people and engage that very, very large audience. Yeah, absolutely. So it's about scale, it's about distance, it's about time, and that's really the power of gamification, not
That's
that
amazing.
it is entirely something new.
That's amazing and perfect. And speaking of time, we're out of it. These 30
We're out
minutes
of it.
always go by so
Okay.
fast, Brian Burke.
You know,
You can all get Brian's new book. You can pre-order it at Amazon.com. The link was in the chat. Also come and see Brian and me and a whole bunch of other people at G Summit this June 10th through the 13th. You can get a signed copy of his book there. Brian Burke from Endora, thank you so much for joining us today.
thanks, Dave. It's been my pleasure. Looking forward to seeing you in San Francisco.
Woohoo! Thank
Take
you
care.
all for joining us in the chat as always. We'll see everybody next week for another edition of the Gamification Revolution. In the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter at @GZakerm. See you guys all soon. Keep having fun, everybody.